you done now?
As they said in the film, Back to the Future, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now?
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
My calculations are correct. When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit. Next Saturday night, we're sending you back to the future.
Hello and welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast, the only podcast looking back in time at the greatest film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. I am Brad Gilmore. Welcome to Season 5 of the Back to the Future, the podcast. We are already knee-deep into it, if you will. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, which was the movie trivia Schmodown, the Schmodown Rundown. We did a all Back to the Future trivia challenge to declare the first ever Back to the Future trivia champion of the world. And of course I won. I beat up Frank Janish. I want to shout out to Jeffrey Weissman and Claudia Wells for coming on the show and giving me those shout outs on the competition there. But hey, if you haven't watched it, there's a video. Go to Collider Podcast Network. That's Collider Podcast Network. You'll see the Back to the Future Trivia Challenge, the Back to the Future Rundown Schmodown. It is available right now. But hey, I want to talk to you all about today's match, or not today's match, today's show. We have a very special guest on the show today. We have Steve Concotelli. Steve was the director, and is the director, and was the director of Out of Time, Saving the DeLorean Time Machine. Bob Gale called this movie Everyone Loves a Good Comeback Story, and this is a great comeback story. Very fun documentary. It's available on Amazon and I believe everywhere else. I got the chance to watch it. I remember when the 30th anniversary edition of the series came out inside of a flux capacitor, there was a bonus disc with all kinds of content, including Doc Brown Saves the World, which we'll talk about here on the show probably this season. And then it had like a 20-minute documentary called Out of Time. So I always thought that's what this was. And it was, but it was just a condensed version of the full film, which is, I think, right at an hour or a little over an hour. It's 63 minutes, so a little over an hour. But such a good buy. So if you haven't seen it, if you haven't watched it, I really suggest you watch it now. And we're about to have Steve Concotelli on the phone with us right now talking about this movie, talking about the trials, the tribulations, the filming, the fandom, the meeting Bob Gale, the getting to know Bob Gale, the dealings with Universal, all the things that come into play when you are a filmmaker, especially a documentary filmmaker. I always thought documentaries are some of the hardest movies to make. We talk about all of that today on Back to the Future, the podcast. So I will now fast forward into the space-time continuum, and let's welcome on Steve. And Steve joins us on the show right now. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. I don't know. I think I've been trying to get this together schedule-wise for a long time here for the Back to the Future, the podcast, and I feel like now, for some reason, is that significant moment in time that has allowed it to occur. So I appreciate you making the time for me. You're out. Where are you out? You're out in L.A. right now?
I am. I'm in Los Angeles, yes.
Okay, and now you live there permanently now, right? You're from Milwaukee, is that right?
Yeah, I'm from a little town just outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But yeah, I've been living in Los Angeles for about 18 years now, so I've been here quite a while.
And before we get into the Back to the Future stuff, tell the people what you're a filmmaker, right? You work in the industry.
Yes, I do. My background is television and commercials and kind of reality TV. I really started my career at G4, which was the video game cable network from about 10 years ago, if anybody remembers.
Yeah.
And
Attack of the Show was one of my favorite shows.
And actually, yeah, I was the lead editor on Attack of the Show. So
there you go.
Yeah,
Can I admit something to you? Layla
Sure.
Cayley used to drive me wild when I was a kid. I'm just saying. I'm just throwing it out there. But continue.
Yeah, she drove everybody wild. She was also very, very nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I work in TV doing commercials and a lot of reality television shows. You know, stuff that you see on cable TV, and and then I had the opportunity to make this awesome Back to the Future movie, and I jumped on it.
Well, I mean, I can't wait to get there. But just to me, when you were younger, growing up in Milwaukee, right outside of Milwaukee, I know that you interned at a news station there in Milwaukee, cleaning out closets or cleaning up the tape, something like that. I know I interned at a radio station, so I'm right there with you. But did you ever have an inkling, like when you were young, did you know that you wanted to go into film? You wanted to move to La La Land and that whole nine?
I always had a hope that I would. Yes, I mean I've always loved filmmaking and movies and TV since I was a kid. They were always what I was fascinated with. And when I was 16, I got my first job at a local TV station, and I learned how to edit. I learned how to shoot. I learned how to make television, and those were my summer jobs. I didn't work in deliver newspapers or anything. I worked in master control, putting TV shows on the air for for local stations. And so it was just something I've always loved and always been fascinated by. And so, in the back of my mind, I had always hoped that I would build up the courage and the nerve to move out here. And, I finally did.
So let's talk about Back to the Future, though. Obviously my favorite film trilogy of all time. I think the greatest film trilogy of all time. But talk to me about your experience with the films as a young kid. I'm sure that you watched them when you were there in Milwaukee. Did it just have that immediate impact on you like it did so many?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was 10 when the first film came out, so I was just old enough to see it in the theater. And, I missed a lot of the family stuff and with Marty and his parents and what that meant. But I was old enough to understand what the time machine was and how cool it was. And, a very common story is, you see it for the first time, and I was just awestruck, just gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it. And from that point on, that was my favorite movie car of all time. And it stayed that way for my entire life, and I would still love to own a DeLorean. I don't, but I'd love to. And it's just the neatest movie car that's ever been made. And just the way it works, the way it looks, the way it feels, the way it has a logic to it. I love everything about it. I just happen to know everything. About
and we're definitely going to dive into that. When you talk about movie cars, here in Houston, right outside of Houston, is the headquarters for the DeLorean Motor Company, and I got to go out there and spend some time with Steven out there, Steven Wynn, who owns DeLorean now, and he gave me a tour of the facility, which is still one of the craziest moments of my life. They had a time machine at the time in their lobby, fully decked out. I think they recently sold it for $88,000. Not joking there, but one of the things that he said is to me, he seemed unsure, as if it was the most iconic movie car of all time. There are some other ones that are in contention. I think the Batmobile, maybe KITT, maybe Herbie the Bug. I don't know. What do you think? What's your top three movie cars? Top three movie cars.
The time machine, I think, no matter who you ask, is far and above all the rest. And I felt that way, but even before making my film, it's a character in the movies. It's such an integral piece of the story. You spend a lot of time in the car with the buttons on the car. The car is the crux of the problem of how Marty gets back in the first film. The car is the crux of the problem in the third film when they have to get it up with the train. I mean, it's integral to the story, and any other car doesn't have that. And the example I use is Ghostbusters. Now, I'm a huge Ghostbusters fan, and I love the Ecto. I love it. But the Ecto isn't critical to any part of the movie. And if you say to somebody, well, name the most famous parts on the Ecto, you can't. There's the lights and there's the tube thing, but it doesn't have names. You don't know how it works. They just use it to drive around in a couple shots. And so, I can't think of any other car, maybe the Batmobile that comes close, but man, I'd say the time machine is the most famous easily. Then maybe you can put far down below the Batmobile and maybe the Ecto, but they fall off pretty quick after that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. And when you talk about the Batmobile, which Batmobile are you talking about? When you say the DeLorean time machine, there's only one of those.
Yeah, exactly.
But let me ask you this, because I'm sure since you've gone down this journey with Back to the Future, I'm sure you know a lot of the trivia of the films, and you know that originally it wasn't going to be a DeLorean time machine. It wasn't going to be a car at all. It was going to be a refrigerator.
Correct.
Talk to me about that, because I've thought about it a lot, and I know that it kind of ended up being used. The refrigerator, because it was lead lined, would protect you from a nuclear blast, is what they were thinking, and that was kind of later used in an Indiana Jones movie, infamously for most fans. Have you ever thought about would you have made? I guess my question is, would you have made a movie eventually about a refrigerator? I don't think that would have been as entertaining.
Yeah, my guess is not likely. No, because if that were the case, I don't know if Back to the Future would have quite the following it does now if it was the refrigerator. And Doc Brown had a monkey as an assistant.
Right, and he was Professor Brown, who was named Spaceman from Pluto. But I really think, though, you hit something on the car is the crux of the film. And so much tension. There is so much dramatic tension that's built inherently in a vehicle, in an automobile. I mean, right when Marty's about to take off in 1955 to go back to the future and the car doesn't start. You couldn't have that same drama with a refrigerator or anything else. So I definitely think that you're 100% on. Even in some of those Batman movies, the Batmobile isn't the crux of the film. He doesn't need the Batmobile to defeat the Joker. So let's talk about, though, after the movies, go out in theaters, it's one of the biggest franchises of all time. Universal Studios wanted to put or had the time machine in their backlot for people to go see. And they didn't keep it up very well, which is just shocking to me that this is what many people consider, especially you and I, the most iconic car of all time in film, and they just kind of let it go to hell. What was the reasoning behind that?
And see, that's something that I actually wanted to dive into in my documentary, is because when people find out that the car sitting outside at Universal for 20 years was the real screen-used hero car, they have the same reaction. They're indignant. They're like, how could this happen? How could they let it fall apart? But when you dive into the reality of it, what you find out is that, first of all, the studio kept the car, which was rare at the time. Because even up to the 80s, after a film was made, the props were just tossed because they weren't the product. The film was. But Universal recognized the car was special. So the Time Machine is one of the first movie cars that the studio kept and maintained. Nowadays, of course, they keep everything, so it's very different. But back at the time, that was rare. And then what they did is they did try to maintain it. Transportation department, they did try to keep the car running, but a Time Machine is a film prop. It's not a studio theme park ride. So what that means is when you build a movie prop, it's very fragile. Like you screw stuff on just to last for production, which is maybe a week, and glass tubes and things hanging off, and you just fix it for a shot. It's not meant to be durable or long term. So when you put something very fragile outside where fans can touch it, where weather gets at it, it falls apart quickly, and that's just the nature of it. And Universal, they did try. They gave it a good try to keep the car up. Was it as good as fans we would have liked? No, but they tried to maintain it. They tried to keep it in decent order. And so when people beg on Universal, I tend to go easy on that, because they really did try to keep the car presentable and so that fans could enjoy it. But it's so fragile that unless they just stuck it in a museum right away, you can't keep a car like that maintained, looking good and drivable in a theme park. You just can't.
One of the greatest things about your film is it does a great job of laying out the history of this iconic car and how it got to the state that it was in prior to the restoration. But one of the craziest things that stuck out to me, and I'm sure sticks out to everybody when they see this film or when they hear about the stories, is that fans not only could have access to the car and see it just sitting there on a back lot, fans could actually sit in the car, take pictures in the car. Sometimes the keys were left in the vehicle. They would take pieces off of this car. That is just mind-boggling to me. Why was that allowed to happen?
Well, it wasn't allowed. They did it anyway, because this is, we're talking about the 90s through the early 2000s, when if you knew how to get on the Universal backlot, it wasn't terribly difficult. If you knew somebody, if you had friends, you could get on the lot. And the Time Machine was left on the backlot, so it was not publicly accessible, if you were visiting the park. It was at night parked around back. But if you had access to the backlot, you could go see it. And of course, people work on the backlot all night long. So fans who were in the industry with, who had friends in the industry knew where the car was, and they would take little excursions to go up and see the car at night and take pictures. And, being a backlot, they didn't always lock the cars because the Doc Brown performers would use them during the day, then just drive them around back and park them. It was considered a secure area. But fans who knew better would get in there. The car would be open. Sometimes the keys would be in the car. They could start the car up. And yeah, some other fans did in fact steal pieces off the car, or when a piece would fall off onto the ground, they would take that. So yeah, I mean, it was not great. And, but the fans did it because they simply wanted to be a part of the car. I mean, there's a photo in the film of when they talk about fans stealing parts off. It's a photo of me next to the car when I snuck on the back lot in like 2000, because I did the same thing. It was the middle of the night. A friend got me on the lot, and I got a bunch of pictures of me standing next to the time machine. I didn't take anything, just everybody knows.
but you were tempted.
Yeah, but we all snuck on and did that because we were all huge fans.
Right.
Some were more aggressive than others, and but that's just what happens.
So I believe it was 2011, it was announced that they were going to restore the vehicle. Bob Gale, in conjunction with Universal, made a statement that they were going to, restore this famous movie car. And if I have the story correctly, you knew Joe Walser already? Y'all were friends prior to?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Joe and I met through sheer happenstance, where I edited together a funny trailer that had Goonies of the Caribbean and Goonies and Pirates of the Caribbean mixed together, and it was just something I did in my spare time. And Joe saw it online, and he's just like, "Dude, that's hilarious. Are you a fan of '80s?" Huge fan. And he goes, "Well, are you this big of a fan?" And he sent me a photo of the time machine he was working on, his first one. And I'm just like, "I don't know who you are, but you're my friend. Where are you?" And it turns out he lives here in Los Angeles. So we met up, and I saw his car, and we bonded over all things Back to the Future, and Explorers is a huge movie of ours, and Goonies. And Joe at the time was working on his first time machine that he was building for himself, but he had been doing research on how to build time machines for about a decade. And he was quickly gaining notoriety within the community of being the best time machine builder. So that way, when the restoration came around, Joe had been doing all this work in the Back to the Future community. He'd built he built the two best replicas in the world. And so Bob Gale knew Joe personally and went to him. And then, of course, I knew Joe, and I'm like, I have to help out on this project. I cannot sit out on this project. I have to be a part of it.
So you just like, hey, I mean, because here's the thing, I guess, really, it kind of presents itself as this great documentary already, or as this great film. There's a great story. And it even says on the cover of the DVD, everyone loves a good comeback story, and this is a great comeback story. Bob Gale said that. So the story was there. And did you just say, look, I've got this background? Because to this point, had you done any feature length?
No.
Anything?
No.
Okay, no.
No, I had done television, but I had never produced or directed a feature film. No. And there was a lot of figuring it out as we went, because I knew the restoration was happening, but I really didn't know what the movie would be. I mean, I had an idea, like, tell the story of how it got here and what happened to all the cars and follow the restoration. But, the restoration was it was a year-long process. It was a year-long, very, very difficult, very time-consuming, grueling, brutal restoration on Joe and the entire team. So, how brutal it would be, we had no idea. But I talked to Joe, and actually the way it started was Joe's like, I said, "Joe, I want to be on the team." And Joe's just like, "Well, look, I have 1,000 people who want to be on the team. What can you do that nobody else can?" Because Joe was looking for the best of the best. He didn't want just people who were fans. He wanted people who could contribute to the restoration. That's very different, because we're all fans, and we're all like, "Oh, I'd love to help out." And Joe's just like, "Great. Are you an industrial mechanic? Are you a welder? Are you a painter? Do you work on DeLoreans?" And a lot of people are like, "No." He's like, "Well, I'm sorry, then I can't use you." And that's the boat I fell into, because I don't know cars. I don't know props. I don't do any of that stuff. And Joe looks at me and just says, "Well, what good are you on this restoration?" And I said, "Well, I have a camera and I'm really good at making movies. And he goes, done. That's your job. And so that's how I got on the team.
So you were just
my
donned.
job became,
Yeah.
my job became documenting the restoration. And that was my official job on the team.
Now, did you have to do, though, much, not research, specifically on the DeLorean, but did you have to do a lot of research just on how to lay out a documentary? Did you go to Netflix? Did you go to Amazon and just get every documentary you could and look at just examples? Or what was your mindset?
There was a little bit of that, sure, where, I had an idea, like, the story is so linear, like history of the time machine, start the restoration, then you go through the restoration, then it ends, and then, big party celebration in the end. So I kind of knew how it would be, but everything else in terms of how to do the interviews, what do the interviews talk about, how to, how to tell the exact story. That was a lot of filmmaker details that it's easy to get lost in the weeds, like how far down the rabbit hole do we go in terms of detail? Like here we're disconnecting the muffler and here we're putting on the brake pads. Like fans don't care about those things, so we wanted to have details that Back to the Future fans had never heard of and would appreciate, but not so much detail that it just felt like a car documentary where people wouldn't care. And the litmus test I used was my wife, where my wife is a casual fan of Back to the Future. So if she could sit down and enjoy the film and follow it, then I knew I was in the sweet spot. But if she's just like, nope, I don't care what color the wires were, I don't care, what the calipers and don't care about any of that stuff, then I would have known it was too far off the path.
But part of being a documentarian, and I know from some of the limited stuff that I've done, is you have to shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and get all this footage, and then you have to whittle it down to an hour and a half, whatever it might be. But this is my thing is, I would always be afraid if I were shooting a documentary and then I wouldn't be there for a great moment because, just talk to me about that, because I've always thought about in some of the documentaries that I've seen, I'm always like, God, man, they're so lucky they were right there when that happened.
No, that was a weekly battle with Joe and I, because I could only shoot on the weekends because I had a full-time job. And so I would be up there at the restoration all day Saturday, all day Sunday shooting. And Joe is trying to hit deadlines, trying to do a restoration, but he'd be like, okay, Steve, we have to take all the panels off the car this week. I'm like, well, you have to do it on Saturday so I can be there. He says, and that would always be a source of contention. He says, well, I can't wait to do this stuff when you're around. And I'd have to beg him or, find a way to do it or get up there and capture these moments. And I was constantly coordinating with him about, what are you doing today? Are you going to put anything back on the car? Are you going to take anything off the car? Always afraid I was going to miss some crucial moment, because you're right. When you make a documentary, you have to shoot everything because you don't know what you'll need. And I think I shot about 80 hours of B-roll footage.
Wow.
And that's just a ton. It's a ton. And for a 1 hour documentary, that's way overshot. And by the way, that doesn't include interviews. Interviews, I think, were another 40 hours. So I had well over 120 hours of content for a 1 hour movie. And it's just like, oh my God. But, you can't miss something, because that'll be the one thing that, that they want to talk about, or the one thing that was important. And so I just shot as much as I possibly could and tried to build the story from there. But yeah, just missing something was always my biggest fear, that I wouldn't be there. I would just show up one day and then the card simply be done. And I'd be like, what? I missed it.
Or some big event happened that you missed, or some big blow up with Joe and maybe some of the crew. And that's a valid concern. I've always thought about, man, how lucky do you have to be sometimes to catch lightning in a bottle when it comes to a documentary? And I think you have to be pretty lucky. I mean, there's a lot of planning there, but you just never know when you're capturing real life events when a real life event is going to occur. And and I always thought that's something I always tip my cap to documentary filmmakers, because it's really incredible to me. But talk to me about, though, you had 120 hours of footage. Yeah. How do you whittle that down to an hour?
Slowly. It took me 2 years to cut the film.
Wow.
And that's a long time. I mean, and that's still, though, like, in terms of documentaries, I know people who takes them 4 or 5 years to edit their films. So 2 years is actually on the shorter side. But I just slowly going through, finding out what my footage was, and finding out what the story was. That was the hard part, was crafting a story, because I didn't use voiceover narration like a lot of documentaries do. I used only sound bites from the interviews, and that just took way longer because, you're trying to find this exact phrasing or this exact wording and find the guys who said it. But it's just a brutal process of, okay, let's start this and see how it goes, and moving stuff around and tweaking things and telling the story. Editing was very, very, very hard. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, and it's the editors never get enough credit, and especially to be able to shoot your film and edit it, that's an incredible task. One of the craziest things though in the documentary was we talked earlier about how fans would take parts off the DeLorean and take them home with them for a souvenir or what have you. But when y'all started to put this car back together, when Joe was leading the charge for it, he wanted to be as accurate as possible and use all the original parts that he possibly could. So Bob Gale put out a bulletin, put out word throughout the Back to the Future community that if you were one of these people who took a part off the DeLorean, send it back to us. Now, when I heard that, I was like, there's no way if somebody's got their flux capacitor sitting on their mantle from the original car, they're going to send that back in. There's no way they're going to do it. But to my surprise, a lot of fans did it. Did that shock you?
Not really, actually.
Really?
It was surprising, yes. And that's one of my favorite parts of the film, is when Joe gets these pieces back from these fans and can put them back on the car, including the original screen-used flux capacitor, which was huge. But, I guess it is surprising at first, but when you think about it, these Back to the Future fans who took these parts off, they took these pieces because they didn't want them to fall apart or get lost or broken. They wanted them to be saved because they recognized these were important. And so when Bob put that shout out to say, hey, we're restoring the car, I'm doing it, we're doing it correctly, please give these parts back, it makes sense that the fans who care about the film respect the film enough to return these pieces to where they belong. And that's what a lot of the fans said. Like, look, we just wanted to make sure these pieces were taken care of and that they end up where they belong. And, to give them back to Joe worked out very well. And in fact, the irony of it is that because these fans took parts off the car and kept them in their houses all these years, those parts were in far better condition than the parts that were left on the car. And so it actually helped Joe and the restoration team immensely. And so in a kind of a backwards way, they did the restoration of service in some way.
Well, somehow, some way, it ended up all working out. I just think that, I don't know. I would like to think, Steve, that I would do it if I had, the flux capacitor sitting on my mantle, or I had Mr. Fusion, or I had whatever. I would like to think that I would send it back in. I'm just going to stick to that. I would like to think that I would do it. I don't know if I would be. I don't know if I'd be able to. Out of Time Movie is the website to find the film. A couple more things for you, Steve, before we get you out of here. Let's talk a little bit about the final day. The final day of shooting, and then the restoration is finished. What was going through your head that day? And how did you feel?
Well, we were all exhausted because on the final day, the restoration was an entire calendar year, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, Joe and the team finished the car at 3 a.m, and Universal picked it up at 7 a.m. So they had 4 hours to spare out of an entire year. And so that's how tight the deadline was. And so, here it is. It's like 1 a.m. in a freezing warehouse in Santa Clarita, which is far away from LA. And like Joe and the team are hustling to try to get the car done. I'm trying to get beauty shots of the car. I'm trying to get interviews, I'm trying to paint it as this celebratory atmosphere. But the reality was Joe was just like, Steve, get out of the way. We got to finish the car. I don't have time for your crap right now. And so it was a lot of back and forth. And, yes, there were moments when they celebrated, and they popped the champagne, but I remember it quite differently. I remember it just being go, go, go and trying to get stuff done. And, we'll celebrate when it's on display. That day, even the final day was rushing to get stuff done and making sure we had everything. So, it was a race right to the end.
Man, but then, what's funny is, though, they finished their job, but you still had this long process ahead of you. So it wasn't out of your life just yet.
No, that's just it. Yeah, the restoration, everybody else got to work on the restoration for 1 year, and I worked on it for 4 because the restoration was a year, and then it took me 3 years to shoot, cut, get distribution on the film, work with Universal Studios, get licensing on everything. Because as a filmmaker, I mean, you can appreciate this. Making a documentary, if you just go out and make a documentary, you can do it. It's doable. But when you make a documentary about a very, very famous film series, that's a whole other level of trouble, because suddenly you're dealing with intellectual property rights. Michael J. Fox, have to have him sign off. Christopher Lloyd has to sign off. Bob Zemeckis has to sign off. Amblin has to sign off. Universal has to sign off. Spielberg's office has to sign off. And you have all these levels of complexity and licensing, and has to go through Universal's legal department. It was a tremendously complicated challenge. That was half the film. Like, making the movie was only half the challenge. The other half was navigating this whole system of making a film within a studio and working with Universal.
Yeah, and that is, I think, an interesting aspect that not a lot of people think about, is just all the legalities that go on. And I'm sure having Bob Gale on your side maybe helped a little bit there.
Well, he helped a ton. No, the only reason the film got done is because I had Bob Gale there. Because
right.
Early on, I have never worked with a major studio to try to make a movie. I was just making like my little fan documentary. And, as Universal started taking interest in it, and they started talking about putting a portion of my film on the Back to the Future 30th anniversary Blu-ray in 2015. Well, then it was, okay, Bob, what do we do for this? And how do I do that? And he's just like, okay, relax, Steve. I'll set you up with the right person. Here's what you do. Here's the person you talk to. And Bob cleared off. Oh, that was you. Bob cleared off a lot of hurdles for me, and he made the film possible. I actually can't say enough good things about Bob Gale. Like, he got personally involved in the making of my film, helped me, guided me, and really made it possible to get the film done. So, and he didn't have to at all. And he still helped me a lot. So, yeah, I owe a lot to Bob.
He seems just like, somebody who's very appreciative that people still want to do things regarding Back to the Future. I mean, even though it's one of the biggest movies of all time, I feel like he still almost feels like, man, I'm so blessed that people like my movie and like my idea.
Very much. In fact, Bob, even today, he's still kind of the godfather of everything Back to the Future. Like, if a decision gets made about something creative with Back to the Future, it goes through Bob, and he's the ultimate authority on it. And because Bob is very careful and protective of the franchise, he understands what it means to fans, and he always, in every decision he makes, tries to do right by Back to the Future fans. And yeah, he appreciates the fandom. He loves the fans. He's very moved that fans still love his film. And, as a fan myself, to essentially make a Back to the Future film was a very wild and surreal experience, because here I am working with Bob Gale on a Back to the Future movie about his movie. And that's, as a fan, that's about the greatest thing I'll do right there. Like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to top that as a film. Like, I'm like done. Like, I made a movie about my favorite movie, and thanks to Bob, my film is officially recognized by Universal Studios as being the official Time Machine documentary. So that's very cool. I'm very lucky in that regard.
And then how did it feel? You mentioned it, and this was actually not the first time I heard about the film, but I remember getting that 30th anniversary Blu-ray set. And, that came in the flux capacitor, and Out of Time is featured in that. So it's a different version than what the full film is.
Correct. I had pitched the idea of putting the full version on there, but I didn't have enough time to cut it, and Universal wasn't interested in the full feature. So I essentially cut down a short, I believe it's a 20-minute featurette version. So it's basically just the highlights of the restoration. It's the hors d'oeuvre, and then my film is the main course, so that just gives you a little taste of the restoration, and then people can check out my film. But yeah, I did it because it was a chance to have a part of my film that, I just made on my own one day, to have it as a part of an actual Back to the Future Blu-ray release. I'm just like, you're kidding me. Of course I want to do that. The answer is yes. And so, and to do that, though, again, I had to work with Universal's marketing, licensing, legal, worked with Bob. physical production to try to make sure that my film technically was correct, to make sure I had all the paperwork, because you have to have all your paperwork in order. And that means, talent releases, location releases, insurance, title clearance, like all this stuff I never thought about. But Universal expects that, because they're not going to use your film without it. So yeah, it was quite an education. But
Yeah.
I was thrilled. I'm thrilled that Out of Time, even when I look at the Back to the Future trilogy box set with the flux capacitor, it still trips me out to see my film on there, and just knowing that it's a part of Back to the Future's legacy from here on is just, I think that's very cool.
And it's well done. Any Back to the Future fan out there, if you haven't seen Out of Time, it's available on Blu-ray. You can go to OUTATIMEmovie.com to find out more ways to watch it. I own it on Blu-ray. I'm sure you can stream it, I think, on Amazon as well.
You can. It's available on Blu-ray and DVD. It's region free, and we actually ship worldwide. So wherever you are in the world, if you want a copy, you can order it from us, and we'll ship it to you, and it'll play on your player. It's also streaming worldwide on Vimeo. That includes all the bonus features. And then it's also on iTunes. And I believe you can order it on Amazon through their streaming service as well.
Well, there you
go.
go.
But the best way to do it is just go to Out of Time Movie, and that's Out of Time, like the license plate spelling, OUTATIME movie.com. And I run the website, so you can ask me questions. I'm happy to sign any copies of the movie. Joe Walzer, he'll happy to sign copies of the Blu-ray and DVD for fans who request it. And you can watch Out of Time today.
Well, last question for you, Steve, before we get you out of here. I ask everybody this: what's your favorite time period from the films, your favorite version of the DeLorean, and your favorite film of the three?
You know what? I'm oddly ill-prepared for this question. It's funny. It seems like such a go-to question, and I'm not prepared. So let's take them in order. What was the first question?
Okay, your favorite time period from the films.
You know what? I have a sweet spot just for the original, the 1985, because now it has a certain nostalgia. Like Marty and the world he lived in 1985. At the time, growing up, it's just like, oh, that's reality. But now you look back on it, and just it reminds me of my childhood, and not so much Marty's crappy home life, but just that, the world of the Twin Pines Mall and stuff. I like that part, I love it. So that's my favorite, the original 1985 timeline.
Okay, and then favorite version of the time machine.
I have to say, I like the original part one version of the time machine. It's the plutonium chamber version, that didn't fly yet. There's just something that and people have this debate all the time, Mr. Fusion versus plutonium reactor, but just the plutonium reactor, it just looks so dangerous. It just looks so cool. It just looks like it's going to blow up any minute. And it just had this aggressiveness to it that I love. I still love it.
Well, given your first two answers, I think the third question might rather be easy, but your favorite of the films.
Yeah, it's still got to be the first one, just because now as an adult, it's funny. As a kid, I appreciated it because it was neat. Like, go back 30 years and, wow, the 50s were a really strange time. Of course, what do we know? But then now, 30 years later, it's fun to look back on, like, if the movie took place in 2018, going back to 1998 or 1988, just how much has changed since then with computers and technology. And my son, who's 7, if he went back in time, he'd be lost without cell phones, without iPads, without streaming movies. And it'd be funny to see him flounder like Marty does, And so there's just that idea of going back 30 years and visiting your parents and being a fish out of water. I love that. And today, if you did it today, it would be just as wild, I think. Although I hope they don't ever redo it. I don't write me down as being in favor of that. I'm not. And Bob has said they won't, so I'm not too worried.
All right, well, I'm going to hold Bob and you to your word on that one. I'm kind of with you on that. But Steve, you can get his movie at Out of Time Movie. That's OUTA Time movie.com. And Steve, I appreciate you for taking some time for us.
My pleasure.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now? Oh, Brad, what have you done now?